Somewhere around 12,000 years ago, in a region we now call the Fertile Crescent, humans made a decision that would define the rest of our species' history. They stopped following food, they started growing it. It sounds like obvious progress: stable food supply, permanent homes, the birth of everything we now associate with civilization, cities, writing, government, eventually the entire concept of a job you go to every day. If you've watched our earlier video on what life looked like before jobs existed, this is the moment that changes everything. This is where work, in the modern sense, actually begins. A wide shot of early farmers bent over a field of wild wheat at dawn, hands moving methodically along the stalks, golden light catching the grain, the quiet birth of agriculture rendered as an ordinary, unremarkable morning. But here's the part that rarely makes it into the story. When archaeologists actually dug up the skeletons of the first farmers and compared them to the hunter-gatherers who came before them, they found something that doesn't fit the progress narrative at all. The first farmers were shorter, sicker, more malnourished. In some regions, adult height dropped by as much as 5 to 6 inches within a few thousand years of adopting agriculture. Teeth show more cavities, bones show more signs of disease and nutritional stress. By nearly every physical measure available to archaeology, becoming a farmer made your individual life worse, not better. So today we're asking an uncomfortable question. If farming made people shorter, sicker, and more malnourished than the hunter-gatherers before them, why did they do it? And more importantly, once they realized it was making things worse, why didn't they just stop? The answer isn't about stupidity or bad luck or a mistake anyone could have avoided. It's about a trap that, once triggered, may have been almost impossible to escape. A trap built not out of individual choices, but out of simple math. This is one of those rare moments in history where the evidence buried in bones tells a more honest story than the one we usually get taught. No dramatic invasion, no single genius inventor, just a slow, almost invisible shift made one growing season at a time that eventually reshaped what it meant to be human. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what hunter-gatherer life actually looked like physically on a skeleton. We touched on some of this in an earlier video, but it's worth revisiting here with a sharper focus: bones. Hunter-gatherer skeletons, on average, show something archaeologists call robusticity: thick, dense bone structure built up from a physically varied life, running, climbing, carrying, throwing, constantly shifting terrain and activity. Their diet, drawn from dozens or even hundreds of different wild plant and animal sources depending on the season, meant that if one food source failed, there were usually others to fall back on. Nutritionally, it was a diversified portfolio, not a single bet. Early farmer skeletons tell a completely different story. Bones show reduced robusticity, the physical signature of a narrower, more repetitive set of movements, largely tied to the same patch of land, doing similar motions season after season. And the diet narrows dramatically. Instead of dozens of food sources, early agricultural communities often depended heavily on 1 or 2 staple crops: wheat, barley, rice, maize, depending on the region. Nutritious, calorie-dense, storable, but nutritionally narrow in a way hunter-gatherer diets simply weren't. That narrowness turned out to be dangerous. A hunter-gatherer band facing a bad season for one food source could shift to another. An early farming village depending on a single crop faced something far more binary. If that crop failed, drought, blight, pests, there was often no equally abundant backup: feast or famine, with much less room in between. It's worth noting archaeology doesn't speak with one unanimous voice here. A few specific sites, including one notable case in ancient Vietnam, show hunter-gatherers and early farmers with surprisingly similar disease burdens, suggesting the story varied by region and circumstance. But taken across dozens of populations studied globally, the broader pattern holds remarkably consistently. Individual physical health measurably declined with the arrival of agriculture, even as something else, something much bigger, was quietly beginning to grow. None of this means hunter-gatherer life was some kind of paradise either. It carried its own dangers, its own scarcity, its own hard seasons. The point isn't that one lifestyle was perfect and the other a mistake. It's that the skeletons themselves, measured and compared across continents, consistently tell a story that contradicts the version most of us grew up hearing. That something bigger was population. And this is where the story stops being simply sad and starts being genuinely strange. A wide aerial-style view over a valley, showing a scattering of a few hunter-gatherer camps in the distance, cutting to a much denser cluster of small farming settlements nearby, the same land supporting visibly more people. A patch of wild land foraged by hunter-gatherers can support a certain number of people per square mile, and that number is genuinely small because wild food density has hard natural limits. Cultivated farmland, by contrast, can produce somewhere between 10 and 100 times more usable calories from the exact same amount of land. That difference doesn't sound like health, it sounds like arithmetic. But arithmetic over enough generations becomes destiny. More calories per acre means a population can grow faster, even if each individual within that population is, on average, shorter, sicker, and less robust than their hunter-gatherer neighbors. It's a genuinely uncomfortable insight. The better way of life, health-wise, lost, not because it was inferior, but because it couldn't outproduce people fast enough to compete with a lifestyle that valued caloric output over individual well-being. Think about what that actually implies. Success, in the long run of human history, wasn't measured by how well any single person lived. It was measured by how many descendants a way of life could produce and sustain. Health lost to arithmetic, over and over again across nearly every continent where this transition eventually occurred. So why didn't anyone just stop? If early farmers could see within their own lifetimes that their children were shorter and sicker than stories suggested their grandparents' generation had been, why not go back? The honest answer is, by the time the costs became visible, going back usually wasn't a real option anymore. Population had already grown to numbers the surrounding wild landscape simply couldn't feed through foraging alone. The land itself had often changed too, cleared, farmed, sometimes depleted in ways that made a full return to the old hunting and gathering territory less viable than it once was. And socially, entire generations had now grown up knowing only farming life. The accumulated practical knowledge of which wild plants were safe, where seasonal game reliably appeared, how to survive as a small mobile band. All of it degrades and gets lost remarkably fast once it stops being actively practiced and passed down. This is sometimes called a demographic trap, and it's one of the more unsettling patterns in human history. A change that makes individual lives measurably worse can still become permanent and irreversible simply because it wins on population math, and because the road back closes quietly behind you while you're still walking forward. Nobody voted for this outcome. No single generation chose deliberately, let's make our descendants shorter and sicker in exchange for more of them existing. It happened as an accumulation of small, locally reasonable decisions, compounding over centuries into a shift nobody was steering on purpose. It's worth sitting with how little malice or foolishness is required to explain something this consequential. Sometimes the biggest turns in human history aren't decisions at all. They're just math, operating patiently across enough generations for the results to become undeniable, and by then, unchangeable. There's something almost humbling in that. We like to imagine history as a series of choices made by people who understood the stakes. More often, it seems to be the slow accumulation of choices made by people who understood almost nothing about where they were heading, simply responding reasonably to the situation directly in front of them. Here's the part that I think reframes the entire story. We tend to imagine the agricultural revolution as an obvious step forward, humanity finally getting smart enough to grow its own food instead of scavenging for it. The truth is closer to the opposite, a way of life that was, in almost every measurable physical sense, worse for the people living it, outcompeted a healthier one, purely through numbers, and then became permanent because there was no clear way back. A final wide shot transitioning from a small ancient farming village at dusk to a modern city skyline at night, the same underlying pattern, density, permanence, specialization, echoing forward across thousands of years. And in a strange way, we're still living inside the consequences of that trade. Nearly every institution we now think of as simply how life works, permanent settlements, stored food, specialized labor, eventually money, eventually the very concept of a job, traces its roots back to that one shift made by people who couldn't have known where it would lead, responding to pressures they could barely see, let alone control. It also complicates any tidy story about human progress moving in a straight line from worse to better. Sometimes it moves from healthier to sicker, from more varied to more narrow, and simply gets called progress anyway because the population count went up. It's worth asking, honestly, how many decisions in our own lives and in the systems we now take for granted might follow that same quiet logic, not necessarily better for any one person living through it, just better at producing more of what comes next. Maybe that's the real thread connecting this video to where Kindled started. We began by asking what life looked like before jobs existed. It turns out the moment jobs began was also the moment individual human bodies started quietly and measurably to get worse off. A trade nobody consciously chose and one none of us can meaningfully undo. We simply inherited it generations later and mostly call it normal. If questions like this interest you, Kindled goes back to a different corner of human history every week, the parts nobody taught you in school.